everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Attendance Bias. I am your host, Brian Weinstein. Today's guest is Steven Gripp, the creator of the Phish Mapping Project. Steven is here today to tell about one of his favorite segments of live Phish that he's ever witnessed, that being 46 Days Into the Dogs, back into 46 Days from the Austin 360 Amphitheater on July 28, 2015 in Austin, Texas. Steven and I also talk quite a bit about his project. If you're a nerdy fan like me who would spend hours on a wormhole on Phish.net or used to read and reread the Pharmer's Almanac, the Phish Mapping Project is right up your alley. Basically, Steven took years of research and meticulous mapping of every Phish show on record and created an interactive worldwide digital map of their history using Google Tours and Google Maps. If you have a favorite show but always wanted to know what the venue looked like or where the venue actually is or what the pictures inside were like, the Phish Mapping Project has you covered. There are more dimensions to it than I can explain here, but that's why we have Steven to tell us all about it. In addition, we cannot forget the 46 Days The Dogs musical sandwich that Steven brought to the episode. The summer 2015 tour is peak Phish, and even an average great show would have highlights that would stand out when all was said and done. This power rock combination certainly meets that criteria, and after all, who doesn't love a flawless segue? So let's join Steven to talk about 1993 Phish, the best versions of Cross-Eyed and Painless, Phish in the Lone Star State, and much more as we discuss 46 Days Into the Dogs, back into 46 Days from July 28th, 2015 at the Austin 360 Amphitheater in Austin, Texas. Steven, welcome to Attendance Bias. How are you?
I'm doing great. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. I'm very excited today, not just to talk about the track that you selected, the jam that you picked, but also about something that's even bigger than any track, any show, or any tour, really. That is your Phish Mapping Project, which is a project that we'll get into the details, and hopefully if the listeners at home haven't heard about it yet, that they can kind of wrap their mind around it by our conversation. And then as soon as this episode is over, hopefully they'll get right onto it. Because I got to tell you, I have been just immersed in it since I heard about it from Phish.net and also my buddies over at the Helping Friendly podcast.
Yeah, it has been 3 years in the making. The project itself, I wanted something to leave like a legacy for Phish and saying thank you for what they've done. And this is something that I was thinking about for a very long time. And Google Earth actually put together, not for me, but put together the resources and the infrastructure of how to put together a project of this magnitude. And so, 3 years ago, I just started with day one, the first show, and I just started putting together where the venue was, the review of the show, audio of the show. I just wanted like a full experience for somebody who just wants to dive into Phish, whether they're brand new or they've been around forever, and just go in and just kind of like immerse themselves like you have done, just experiencing where they've been and how they got to where they've gotten to.
Yeah, and I find that stuff fascinating. I love patterns. I love looking at tour routes. And I've done that on this podcast where I kind of Google map, like a run of shows, and I see how many miles has it been, like how many states do you go through and how long it must take if you were just to go straight in one shot. And your project just kind of makes me see what I already know, but think about it in a different way. But just for the listener's sake, before we get a little deeper into the Phish Mapping Project, I've neglected so far to say that the music we're here to discuss is a segment, the second set opener from July 28th, 2015 at the Austin 360 Amphitheater in Austin, Texas. A great segment of 46 days, segued right into the Dogs and then back into 46 days. So a dog sandwich that we'll get into toward the latter half of today's episode. But Steven, let's get back to the mapping project. So if you had to give an elevator pitch to explain what the mapping project is, how can you describe it best?
So the Phish Mapping Project consists of every single Phish show, starting from their very first show in Burlington, Vermont at the Harris Mills Cafeteria in 1983, all the way to their most recent show in Madison Square Garden in 2023. So over 40 years of their shows. And it consists of the Google Earth mapping of the venue location, the review of that show, and the audio of that show with additional video if there was video with that show. So it's just a huge universal collection of all of their shows put together that you're able to see and traverse through, where they actually went, not only in the United States, but in Europe and Japan and Mexico.
What I love about it is it's kind of, and this might be presumptuous of me, but it's almost like my project, this podcast, and your project of the mapping are like cousins, because you're giving all the flesh of a certain show or a certain tour. And what I want to hear is the humanity from it, right? The fans' experience there. So if you combined both your project and listen to an episode, any given episode of my podcast, there's very little that you would leave not knowing about a given show.
Yeah. And to be honest, like, I've been a fan. My first show was November 2nd, 96, which we can talk briefly about. But I've been a fan since 96, and there's fans that, from all eras. And even as I've done this project the past 3 years, my understanding of who Phish is and my enjoyment of who Phish is has completely changed going through this project.
What's something that's changed? Like one thing that you felt one way about at the beginning and that you feel differently now?
Well, it's what your title is. I have biases. I had certain biases prior to this project. I grew up on 97. So my favorite shows that I would always revisit were 97 shows. And, you can hear all those podcasts, talking about those 97 shows and how significant they were. I also had a bias of 93 shows. 93 was an interesting year because that was the year they really started to become more unhinged and more focused directly on the improvisation, attention and the release improvisation. So a lot of those shows are, in my opinion, because I didn't grow up during that time, they were harder to listen to the audio because it's so inchoate, their improvisation. So when I went through it and I saw how each show build off of one another, I just had a newfound respect for the courage and the audacity that they were putting forth on stage when they had access to those sheds. Because just a brief history moment, 92, they had those sheds in opening with Santana. They had access to those sheds. So 93 was their first real tour of amphitheaters. They were playing the same amphitheaters the year before, but they were headlining. I took some more time and I listened, and I'm like, oh my goodness, they're taking more risks. They're getting more rewards. And sometimes it's just like, this is their lab. This is where they're experimenting. I just had a whole newfound enjoyment of going through those 93 shows. It was just mind-blowing, just re-listening to it from that lens.
And I'm trying to picture you sitting at a computer. We've all used, or I imagine a lot of us have used, not Google Maps. What was it, Google Maps?
It is Google. It's all Google Maps, yes. They call it Google Tours.
Right, that's the phrase I was looking for.
Yes, yeah, but they kind of just reformatted it to just use Google Earth.
All right, so I can picture you at a computer using Google Tours /Maps. When you talk about your different perspective on their music, were you listening chronologically to some of their music? Like if you were up to 1992 and you said to yourself when you sat down, all right, today I'm going to try and map spring 92 or this segment of the tour, was that the music you were listening to, or was it not that academic?
Oh, it was very academic. I come from academia, so you are correct. It was definitely academic. So I couldn't listen to all the shows, obviously. This project would take decades if I listened to every single show.
Of course, yeah.
But what I did was I read the reviews. I would go to the live Phish releases that they had, and I would listen to those if I haven't heard them in a while or I haven't heard them at all. So there was a couple live Phish releases, plus they had August of 93 that everyone has access to, the 8/13/93,
right,
8/14/93, they had all that, so that 8/7/93. So I would take some time and say, okay, there's a reason that Phish really focused on releasing these albums in this order. I'm going to take some time to listen to at least the show. I didn't want to listen to jams at that time. I want to get a feel of the show. So I would listen to a show while I'm mapping the show and kind of seeing how they patterned their set lists. And using 93 as an example, 93 was really, like I said, their first expedition into being a solo band doing amphitheaters. And so I'm listening to the way that they're presenting their music, the way that they're trying to experiment with their jams. and the way that they're trying to display a certain sense of uniqueness, but also stick to their creativity and their origins, their classic rock origins. It was just very fascinating that they were just so, I mean, I hate to use this word, but they're very vulnerable. They were just putting out all these different types of very unique jams, and the fans just stuck with them. So if someone's asking me about Phish and they're like, what do you recommend? And I recommend a 93 show, they're like, oh my goodness, what is this? It's noise and cacophony. And it's like, I can't get into this. But I felt like that many, many years ago until I went through this and said, oh, they're trying to build this movement of improvisation that is so far different than what they are originally trying to do before 93. So it just brought a newfound love of what they were trying to do.
Right, because with your project, you could literally zoom out and see what they were doing on the road.
Yeah, just a quick aside for this. In 1992, there was the Horde Tour. And so they were a part of the Horde Tour, very much involved with Blues Traveler, Spin Doctors, and there's this book called Jamaica that talks about the Horde Tour and like the origins of it. And they all said, like Blues Traveler and people who talked about Phish's involvement, they're like, you guys have to understand, this band is on a trajectory on their own. They are not of this earth. They are such like prestigious jam masters and creators and curators of this music that they have created, that they're off and running. There's no doubt that this band is going to do their own thing. So in 93, they did perform at the 93 Horde Tour, but only I think one day. But you could see that when they performed that day, there was picture, like it was a flock. Like their fan base was just so locked in from tape trading and just, going and traveling with them that it was inevitable that they were going to, and that's a separate discussion, take the place of the Grateful Dead after the Dead stopped.
I'm glad you brought up the tape trading, because what your project has done for me is, I also, by the way, got into Phish, well, in 96, but my first live show was 97. But when I started collecting tapes, it was advised to me to always, the farther back you can, find the earliest shows you can. I was given recommendations, but I forget who it was. It might have been the person at the head shop who had all the tapes, said, if you find a tape from 93, get it. But if there's one from 91, get that one instead. Like, go as far back as you can, because they were more rare. So what your project has done for me was a lot of these burned into my brain, into my Phish DNA shows that I only know from one specific recording, one specific source, unless it's been released officially. I couldn't picture it. What I'm thinking about is, and I've brought this show up on the podcast before, April 30th, 1994, at the Edge nightclub in Orlando. And it's a completely random show. Like, there's nothing particular
I'm going to go
about
to
it.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. And I always get this wrong. I don't know if it's Possum or David Bowie, but during the intro of one of those two songs, they play a riff from every song they played previously in the set. And to me, that's what tipped me, where I'm like, holy shit, these guys can do anything. And I always have a vision in my head of what it was like inside that club. And to me, it's always bright. And there's sun coming through the windows, because in my head, it's Orlando.
Right.
It's in Florida, so it must be bright. But that's the first show I looked up on your website, and it does not look like what it looks like in my head.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously rebuilt. I'm looking at it now. It's obviously like a reformatted. I mean, it's a cafe now, but there's a picture there of what the Edge looks like. It's a tiny little nightclub. So, interesting thing about Orlando, I went to the University of Central Florida. That's where I went to college and where I got into Phish. And my Phish mentor, his way of getting to Phish is, he said, I have all these. This was summer 96. I just started getting into Phish. He's like, I have all these tapes of 94. Here's how you get into it. Take a tape of 94. He gave me 6/22/94. That was my real first show before even it was released on Live Phish. He's like, get used to how they sound, and you'll get used to the songs and how they do their set lists. And then what I'll do is I'll give you the following show. So he went, 6/25, 6/26, and he just kept going. And we got all the way to 7/16/94. And so I was able to hear, like, that kind of got me into, like, where they're going with their sound, the song choices, and how variegated they were, and how they performed those particular jams. And it really gave me a sense of, these guys aren't just like Pearl Jam or Dave Matthews Band, where they just do different songs every night. They really put an attempt to perform a type of show that night that is going to, one, fit the needs of the fans, like how the fan base is giving them feedback, and two, it's going to give them something that's going to be very different from the night before or previous nights.
So from a user perspective, when I go on the website, and for everyone listening at home, the link to the Phish Mapping Project will certainly be in today's show notes. So definitely check it out if you want to hear what Steven and I are just gushing and nerding out about. Please check the show notes. You'll be able to waste your time for hours and hours if you're anything like us checking it out. You click on the link and you see a globe in front of you on the right side. And on the left, there's kind of a sidebar that divides Phish's eras, I guess I could say, like certain, like what was it, like 1986 to 88, and then 89 to 91, and so forth.
I a little more spread out just because there's so many shows. So I didn't want to put all of it in one link, because I would even get lost and I would lose interest, I've noticed over the years that, it's just overload. Yeah. So I did like 83 to 86, that's like the first real, like they're searching for gigs, and then 87 to 90, 91, 94, 95, 98, 99, 04, then stop it over. So I just basically I did it by theme based on my own listening experience. And I'm able to also put those links there, so that way you just have like just the links over there that you can search through the table of contents and go to different shows in that era.
And when you click on a show, after you drop down the era you're looking for, what happens?
So you click on a show, it takes you to that show, and then you'll see a date, and then you'll see the venue. If you click on the date, it'll give you the show review in Phish.com. So it just talks about the show. And then you click on the venue, and it takes you to the audio, and you can listen to the show. Also, I did some research. If there was a video recording, I put a link in there. So, for example, if you go to the Island Tour of 98, you will see a whole bunch of links, because a lot of people wrote about it. And I also put Spotify links. So if you didn't have live Phish, you can listen to it. I put the Spotify links to those shows. I also had some help with a couple people. One is Alex Grosby of the Phishonian. He's from Vermont, so he was able to double check on my links to make sure that they were at the right venues and the pins were in the right place. He's been a godsend, because he's found some places in the early 90s that I thought I found, and he's like, no, that's the original, that's the new place. This is the original place where Phish played. So that's been a real help. And then Rob Mitchum, who's Phish Crit, who has essays on Substack, he wrote about those shows as you have been podcasting about them, and gives his own personal review of that particular show and what's going on with the band during that time. And he's very funny and gives his own take on that show. So all the links, if there are links for that shows, are in that little box next to where the venue takes place.
Great. So it's kind of a 3D map, if you will, of Phish's history. I mean, I can't think of a more, I could probably think of a more eloquent way to say it given the time, but that's what I picture in my head, kind of like a global look at Phish, as
it's a 30,000 above view of Phish with their history. Yeah.
Wonderful, Steven. So those of you listening at home, please check today's show notes, get lost in it. It's basically the 2024 version of having the Pharmer's Almanac in your bathroom, and just when you're done, you still don't want to get up. Like, it's that kind of, to me, that's what it comes at me with. But Steven, so we've heard about the Phish Mapping Project. Let's hear your profile as a fan with the attendance bias lightning round.
Attendance bias lightning round.
So Steven, you mentioned earlier your first show, but can you remind us when you first saw Phish and what you remember best from it?
My first show was November 2nd, 1996 at the Coral Sky Amphitheater in West Palm Beach, Florida. I was just getting into Phish. A friend of mine that I used to party with was a huge Phish fan. It's been before 96 got me into it, and I saw my first show there. West Palm Beach, I lived in Fort Lauderdale at the time, so West Palm Beach, about 45 minutes out of Fort Lauderdale. I'm a noob at this time. So I was not into the Dead at all. I was not into hippie music. I was a classic rock guy. I really got into Phish because they were so unique and they provided a different sound that I got hooked on. Was just into learning about who they were at the time. So I was very new. So when I drove by myself and I didn't really partake in any recreational habits, if you will. I just really kind of just wanted to experience it. It was to be honest, it was very overwhelming. It was like people walking around in Dead clothes and Phish clothes and just, it was like almost stereotypical, but I only saw it from a noob lens because that's just like I'm trying to associate, So I had a lawn seat in the back, and I remember seeing a percussion set, like they had a percussion because they just did the Omni in Atlanta. They did
Of Remain in Light.
Remain in Light, right? So they had Carl Perazzo's kit up there. So I'm like, oh, I didn't know that they had a fifth guy, and someone told me, oh yeah, they have a guest performer on percussion. It was a long time ago, but the one thing that really sticks out is that they opened with Yamar, and Yamar is one of my favorite like dancing tunes, and it was a sea of people just dancing. I'll never forget it. It was just everyone's just dancing and having a good time and feeling the energy. And I've been to shows like for a year, so I saw a couple shows, and it was nothing like I've ever experienced in my life. So that's what got me hooked right away. The second thing is the Cross-Eyed and Painless, the jam, the extended jam. That was very overwhelming. I mean, it was intense and fast, and it brought me back to like the 94 speed, tension and release, synapse overload. Like I just was trying to process it and I couldn't. It was just so overwhelming. But yeah, that was my first show. And from then on, I just wanted to go see them as much as I could.
Yeah, and I'll just put a plug in for that Cross-Eyed and Painless. When you think about it, and it was kind of presented to me almost isolated. Oh, this show from November 2nd, 96. I didn't really do the math at the time I first heard it and was blown away that it was only the second time they ever played the song.
Right.
Because they premiered it at Halloween 2 nights before. They had the night off on the first. Right. And then the second, let's blow this open, this song that's going to stick with us for the rest of their career, I imagine.
Yeah.
And it really is one of the best. And that's saying a lot. There have been tons of amazing versions of Cross-Eyed and Painless. No one who's a fan of that song should go without hearing this version of Coral Sky 96.
Yeah. I also heard probably one of the best versions. I was at Big Cypress. Plug in.
Oh, for sure.
But that's a whole different experience. I really think that was a catalyst for them to keep that around because that whole show. And then what's crazy is that when we were still watching DVDs, they released it on DVD. And so I was like, oh my goodness, it's like my show that I was at. Like they released it for me. But they did it.
And there's something, and I think I brought this up on another episode, there's something very vindicating that when a show that you think is really, really great, and then the band chooses to release it officially. Yeah. It's like, yes, I knew it. I knew it was good.
Yeah, I would be fascinated to hear, and there probably is out there, people who went to go see a not so popular show and they're like still stuck with it till they got a good show, Because it's those type of things where it's like you go see a show and it was a great show, but it wasn't a monumental show, or it was like, critics are like, Phish critics are like, well, that was a good, not great show,
Right,
people
average grade.
An average grade, yeah. Because average grade is still live Phish. I mean, still better than anything you can see. So it's still great that they would still stick with it. But honestly, I got lucky to see a real banger my first show.
Well, speaking of average grade or real bangers or monuments, what's the most recent time you saw Phish? And what did you think about it?
I've been living in Austin. It's family here. It's hard to get to the East Coast, or what's the closest thing I could get to any show is Alabama or Arkansas, and I just haven't had time over the years. So I'm a couch tourer. I'm guilty as charged. I don't count those shows. So the last actual live show I've been to is Austin in 2018. They came to the 360 Amphitheater. So I always go see them when they come to Austin, or I could drive up to Dallas or the Woodlands. But the last show I saw was 2018. I mean, live, not streaming.
Right.
I stream them all the time.
What did you think of it?
The 2018 show?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a realist. I know, seen many shows and listened to Phish for many years. I know good, not great shows. I really feel like, and we could talk about this, but I really feel that they have a unique relationship with Texas. Paige and Trey are both from there, and they always sense to not, push the limit in their jams or anything, but I think they just are more relaxed. So they're not really interested in trying to push the boundaries of a particular jam. I think they're just more about presentation and homage with their music. So, we can transition into this particular jam. I chose this jam, one, because I saw it, but two, it's a very classical type jam. I mean, it can be considered a micro jam, or it could be considered a standard, type one, not very experimental jam. But it really brought me back to 1.0 days when they were just starting to get into transitioning to, making sure that their seamlessness was, or their transitions were seamless. And this was one of the cleanest, and that's why I really like it.
Well, you're talking about it when you mentioned Texas and how they're just putting on, their best show, maybe not pushing the jams. I was thinking, well, there's a show in May of '94 at the Bomb Factory that might disagree with you.
Oh,
in
yes,
Dallas.
that show.
But
yes.
but the I will get into it a little bit more in detail a little bit later. This 46 Days Dogs sandwich, if we had some sort of Picasso Cubist 3D version of Phish, this could have been played then in the style
Agreed.
in which it was played.
Yeah,
So
this reminds me
we'll dig
a
into
lot
that a
of
little bit
95.
later.
Yes.
Yeah. Coming back to the lightning round, amongst your friends, when you go to a show as a group, what role do you play? For example, are you the guy like me who is just a big ball of anxiety and needs to get to the venue and needs to plan ahead? Are you the planner? Are you the agent of chaos who shows up late and who knows what's in your pockets? Are you the caretaker that gives your friend starbursts during set breaks? How do you see yourself amongst your friend at a Phish show?
So I consider myself the navigator. So like if you have a pilot and a navigator, I'm the navigator. So I'm like, this is how long the show is going to be. Like I remember many years ago, I took a friend and we saw one set and he's like, man, that show was fantastic. And I'm like, that's the first set. We still have a whole nother set to go. And they're like, are you serious? So like I have to navigate the participants into understanding like, okay, this is how, if you're new, this is you're going to expect. This particular song is a ballad, so now's your chance to go use the bathroom. Like I'm kind of like not a cruise director. I guess a cruise director would be not exactly. It's just more of like, hey, I guess you're right. Because the most of the people that I've taken to shows in recent years, 2015 to 16, 18, have all been new. They have not been. There's not a lot of Phish fans. I mean, let me rephrase. I have really not gone out to look for Phish fans. I go to see Phish cover shows, and there's people there checking them out, but there's no real like Northeast or Midwest or West Coast diehard Phish fans like there are in Texas. And they're not as apparent because I guess because they just don't come out here as often. So I'm the navigator. To answer your question, I'm the guy that's like, hey, this is what's happening.
Right, you're Chewbacca.
Yes, correct.
Which is a compliment.
Yeah, correct.
Perfect. So, two lightning round questions based on your Phish Mapping Project. Number one, if you were first in line to get tickets for a show at a given venue, where do you sit? What's your spot at a show? What's your favorite place to watch a show?
I am a through and through lawn guy. I'm a lawn boy because one, I like to have my space. I'm not a tarper. I like to have my space in the lawn. It's not as crowded. I get to hear them. I get to see them from a distance. I'm not surrounded by hardcore fans. I can get easy access to the bathroom, no problem, or go to the concession stand to get drinks. Like every show, there's a couple shows. Like when I went to Miami when they were at American Airlines Arena. I went to go see them in '03, and I was just right over the stage. And I'm like, this is fine. I don't need to be. I'm not like up close feeling the heat. I like to see them from a distance because I like to see the crowd and the energy, and I like to have my space. Yeah,
but also to go with your mapping project. Congratulations! As a reward for finishing your Phish Mapping Project, you now have a time machine. What show or what venue do you want to go back and see Phish play in that no longer exists?
Oh, that's a great question. All right, just right off the top of my head. In 1985, there was a bar that was across the street from Nectar's called Doolin's. And Doolin's was their very first venue that they had a residency at. They performed there, I believe, February of 1985, along with Hunt's, which was a very popular venue they played at. But Doolin's, there's no recordings of them, but that was like their first real like residency that they would play it once a week, and they would start to get what they wanted to look like. So I would want to be what it would be like to just sit in that Doolin's, a tiny little bar with a tiny little stage, and have, and it wasn't even, Page wasn't even there yet. It was the four of those guys just like cranking out tunes and trying to figure out how they're trying to look, and just looking at the lab work, you know? So if I, off the top of my head, that would be an interesting seat to sit in.
And finally, the question I and all of my attendance bias lightning round questions with: what is the weirdest thing you've ever seen at a Phish show?
So I was at Big Cypress, and there was a list of very, very weird things that I saw. I actually was on the Long May They Run Big Cypress podcast that I shared some of those stories with. But just off the top of my head, 12/31/99, when they started the New Year's, they did all that sing. I felt like everyone became completely unhinged and just lost their mind. So there was this section on the floor, on the area, we called it the yellow zone. Okay. It was from the hue of the Ferris wheel. So it's like, yeah, the hue of the Ferris wheel, and there's just like this little circular area that was yellow from the Ferris wheel. And everybody inside, I think, did all the drugs that they did for that evening. And it was just like, this is going to be really nerdy, but are you familiar with Hieronymus Bosch paintings?
Yes, of course.
And
yes.
Like how it's like hell on earth. Like that's what it was like. It was like people were just like bending in weird positions and vomiting, and just like have those looks of complete anxiety and like, what is happening? Because they just started to get into the midnight jams, and it's like, I'm like, I need to get out of here immediately and go back to my camp, because it was absolute insanity how everyone has just lost their mind at this particular time.
When was this show played?
So today's jam, 46 Days Into the Dogs, Back into 46 Days, was played on July 28th, 2015 at the Austin 360 Amphitheater, of course, in Austin, Texas. This show was toward the beginning of a very long 2015 summer tour. Just by a few numbers, Phish played 31 shows in all of 2015. Of course, a lot of that owed to Trey's preparation of Fare Thee Well. Also, I guess 33 shows if you count the January shows from the previous New Year's run, right? January, what was it, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of from Miami? 2015, right? The end of 2014 into 2015.
Yes.
But of these 31, I'm going to say 31. That's the New Year's Eve is from the previous year. 31 shows, 26 of them were played during the summer. And this show in Austin was the 5th show of the tour. For those of us who have gotten into Phish fairly recently, like within the past 5 years or so, it should be noted that this summer 2015 tour had debuts of No Men of No Man's Land, Blaze On, Shade, Mercury, How Many People Are You? And then lesser known songs like Scabbard, Heavy Rotation, but also Slow Llama at Walnut Creek, which was toward the halfway point / end of the summer tour. So it was a big year in a small amount of shows for Phish, and it would be silly not to acknowledge the 5 Fare Thee Well shows and Trey's preparation for them. Were you there?
I was. I went to one show at the Soldier Field.
And listeners of this podcast know that in the summer of 2015, I was recently divorced. I spoiled myself. I went to Fare Thee Well in Chicago, the Phish show in Nashville, shows at the Man, Merriweather Post, Magna Ball. Like, I was all in. And today's show was only one night in Austin. And as you're a current resident of Texas, I've always wondered, how does Phish draw in Texas? I've never been, but I get the sense that there may or may not be a big scene for them. Am I wrong? Or is that just a stereotype that I shouldn't be assuming?
Well, if you are comparing a Phish scene in Austin, Texas to a Phish scene on the Northeast, the jam scene is very much cloistered. It's very much hidden. It does exist, and we do like have some certain jam bands that kind of perform, but Austin specifically, we're about the eclectic sound. We got rich history and blues rock, and we have Texas rock, Americana, a lot of folk rock. So the jam band scene, it's not that it hasn't caught on, it's just there's not a real niche. We just have different pockets where you can catch a Phish or Dead cover band. We have the Far Out Lounge, very exciting to see bands. But the thing about Texas is that we are very much into psychedelic music. We have a very rich history in psychedelic music. So the psychedelic scene is very big. In terms of like specific jam bands that are similar to the Dead or similar to Phish, not as much.
But what is it like when Phish comes to town? Like, because they don't tend to, am I wrong? Like, my impression is that they don't sell out, or it's hard to get a ticket when they play, like, what is it, Starplex? Is that the name of the amphitheater
Yes.
in Dallas? Right.
Correct,
When
yes.
they play
And then the
Dallas or
Woodlands
Austin.
Pavilion.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Do they sell out? Is it an easy ticket?
It's somewhat easy using cash or trade. I usually get my tickets on there for Phish shows, but it is a packed house. It's not like it's empty. The venue's empty, but the Austin 360, it's just like any type of shed. You got your floor, and you got your mezzanine area, and then you got your lawn. But it's a good crowd. But like I said offline, a lot of the people that I chat with when I go to these shows, they're from out of state. They're traveling, or they're coming from the north, like the Midwest. So they come to see the shows in Texas, and very few and far between are the Phish fans that are going to see Phish in Austin.
Steven, who were you? Where were you in the summer of 2015 that led you to this show? What was going on in your life and Phish came to town?
So I was married. I had two boys, very young. They're 14 and 12 now. So it was summer. So I was a teacher at the time. So I had summer off. So I decided, I'm just going to, they're finally coming to Austin. Finally, I get to see Phish in my hometown. And they actually, what was great, just a little side note, they have been to Austin many times. They came to the Suicide Lounge, I think it was called, in '90. They came to the Liberty Lunch. Like, they've been in Austin a few times. But this is the first time where I've been in Austin where they actually were able to perform. So I was like, all right, without a doubt, I'm going to go get tickets. I'm going to go see them. And yeah, it was, he gave thanks for being in Austin, traded. And it was very exciting from a personal perspective to see my favorite band in the town that I live in.
Hi, everybody. Brian here to welcome you to the set break of today's episode of Attendance Bias. First, thank you for listening. And second, just a quick reminder to tell you that even though Attendance Bias comes to you for free, it does take a lot of work and it does take quite a bit of money to keep the lights on here at production. So I just wanted to ask a small favor if you could support the podcast in any number of the following ways. If you could leave a review or a rating of it on whichever podcast app you use. If you could spread the word, telling a friend or someone you think may be interested in it about it. Or probably the most concrete way is to go to www.buymeacoffee.com/attendancebias and donate however much you can financially to help with the continuing costs of Attendance Bias. So thank you again so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the second half of today's episode. Well, let's get into the jam that you chose for today. 46 Days, Into the Dogs, back into 46 Days. This kicked off the second set in 2 or 3 sentences. What was the first set like of this show?
First set, Party Time, I believe, opened. They played Dirt, which is, it's a ballad, but I have not heard Dirt live. And, hear a ballad live like that you haven't heard in a while or they haven't played in a while, it's an emotive tinge. So that's the one thing that I remember about the first set, which was Dirt. The second set, this is what really stuck out in my mind, was this jam. And it wasn't that long. I believe the whole thing was like less than 15 minutes,
Yeah,
but
it's
it's
13
just like
minutes and change. Yeah.
taut, it is concise, and that's what makes Phish make me come back. You can go and jam for 30 minutes and explore and but I go back more to these type of jams than I do to the 30-minute jams, just because I like to hear how they're able to choreograph this type of sound live.
Yeah, it's very impressive listening. I mean, 46 Days is a classic set opener. Good way to get the audience up and pumped after set break. Fishman, you could hear at the very beginning of this recording, and I'm beginning to sound a little more like my middle schoolers. I wrote Fishman is a little extra with eighth notes already at a minute. Like Fishman's already all over the place. And my first thought when I was listening to this track for the first time is that Mike is turned down pretty low on this recording. He comes back a little later, but at the beginning, it's all Phish and Trey.
Yeah.
It's a pretty standard version for the first 2 minutes, gets raunchy in about 3 minutes and 20 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah, and then when they start to transition into the dogs, I mean, it's a standard dogs, but it's like and I don't know notes or chromatic movements or stuff like that, but they said they started to slow it down a little bit just so they can bring in 46 days. And I always wonder, like, is that the game plan, or is that something that Trey just feels like, oh my goodness, this sounds like we're going back into, I got to bring it back because this is exactly like we're landing this 46 days back on the tarmac. Like, this is a perfect landing.
Yeah, to me, my guess, if I had to put money down on it, I would guess this whole thing is improvised. The transitions, that is, into the dogs, for a few reasons. I think that they were still hot on playing the haunted house songs. Like you mentioned, they were fairly new. Right. I think that there's a section in 46 Days, let's see where it is, about 4 minutes and 45 seconds. There's big power chords. whenever Trey specifically plays big, strong, ringing out power chords, is number one, he rarely does it because he's always playing melodies and noodling on his guitar. And number two, I'm a huge fan of The Who. And to me, the Dogs is, to me, sounds like a Who song.
We're celebrating The Who. Yes.
Yeah. But it sounds like a Who song. It sounds like Pete Townsend doing a windmill power chord with just a straightforward like it's not complex. It's not complex classic rock. It's just straightforward rock. And you could hear at that 4 minute and 45 segment that Trey is moving into the Dogs. And then, like you said, Fishman moves to half speed. He cuts back. Yeah. And then by about 6 minutes or so, Page starts playing the Dogs barking sample.
Yeah. I was wondering, when we were discussing what jams I wanted to do, it's like I went back to the awesome jams. I went to different jams that I've seen over the years, and I'm like, no, this is one that I think it stands a test of time, because when you listen to Phish and you start compare eras, as I broke down in the Mapping Project, like, yeah, they sound different in 93 as they do in 97, as they sound in 03, with 2.0 jams. And like, they have these different, sounds. But what makes them so unique is that they always are able to go back in this classic way. And Trey talks about it in interviews in 97. He's like, we want to stick to our roots. And during this time, they've been playing 6 years. They've been on tour for 6 years. They're starting to get back to, being controlling of their shows. And they do this type of jam. And it just reminded me of like clean, very pristine transitions and jamming, to where it's like, all right, this is not the type of type 2 that we're going to getting, but it's also a classic type of Phish exploration and improvisation that just brings back the nostalgia, which I really loved.
And what got it for me, I agree with everything you just said with the clean, pristine transitions, which I love, absolutely adore. But what got me is that it sounded so spontaneous. It sounded like the Dogs and 46 Days were made for each other, the way that it's played here. Yeah.
And the best thing about it is that they never did it again.
Right. It's not they weren't built for each other.
Yeah, it's like they go backstage and they're like, a great show. And they never... I mean, I went back and I tried to look and see if they did 46 Days to Dogs. Nope. Maybe someone online who listens may find it again, but I couldn't find it. And it's like, that's what makes them so unique, is that they always want to authenticate their jams by just doing something so different every single time and leaving it as it is.
And it should be noted, for all the love that I have for The Who and the power chords, that after they go back into 46 Days and start to end the song proper, by around 10 and a half minutes, 12 minutes, they're still playing, but it's starting to kind of peter out in like a very slow, chill, meditative, piano-led melody that, if you asked me what song did this come from, 46 Days would be like number 1,000 on my list. Like, dare I say, this part even sounds like mid-70s Grateful Dead in like playing in the band, sort of. It's kind of aimless, directionless, but it's still compelling to me. Before Trey kind of takes control again, and they eventually segue into Piper.
Yeah, which is a decent Piper. What made this particular show worth discussing is that, we've been listening to Phish for many years, and there's fans that have been around forever. And there's always this discussion of what is the definition of a good, not great show. I forgot who coined that phrase. I think this is a classic example of a really great show. I love this show because it's in my hometown, and it's the first time I saw him in my hometown. But there's nothing that really sticks out that is an aberration of a particular jam. I think it's standard. You go to the show and you walk out satisfied. It's not like I'm going to go listen. I only listen to the show again because it reminds me of me being there. But this is a show where I talk to somebody and I say, "Oh, you really got to listen to this jam," and they're like, "Okay, it's okay." But you need shows like this. You need shows that say, "Hey, this is why you listen to Phish," because you chase these aberrations, you chase these things that we want to get, like a Gamehenge show. These Gamehenge shows do not exist without these shows.
Steven Gripp, thank you so much for coming on to Attendance Bias. And we actually covered a lot of ground in the relatively short amount of time that we spoke. We talked about Coral Sky. We talked about your mapping project, Phish in Texas, Phish in 2015. I mean, even more than that, Big Cypress even.
Yeah.
So I can't thank you enough, number one, for the contribution you've made to the community with the Phish Mapping Project that could provide, I don't know if this is literal, but virtually endless amusement and wormholes for big fans like me, but also taking the time out of your day to come on and talk about this jam that you love so much. Thank you so much.
No problem. And one last thing is I'm on Phish.net and people are leaving comments. Like I said, this is evergreen content. So if there's something that you see that's like, "Oh, this might be incorrect," message me and I'll look at it and we'll talk about it and we'll fix it if that's the correct thing. So I love sharing it. And I also want to thank you for allowing me to be on the show.
And that's it for today's episode with Steven Gripp about the Phish Mapping Project and much more. But we got to go back and make sure we got everything right with the Attendance Bias Fact Check.
Attendance Bias Fact Check.
It should be noted that at the time of this recording, Phish's most recently played show was December 31st, 2023 at Madison Square Garden. For that show that I love that I've brought up in several episodes, April 30th, 1994 at The Edge in Orlando, the song that has all the teases is Possum, not David Bowie. Using Steven's mapping project, I was thrilled to find that there is a soundboard recording available to replace my long-run 4th-generation audience recording that's been playing in my head for over 20 years. Steven's most recent show, he mentions, was in Austin in 2018. The date of that show is July 31st, 2018. I haven't heard it, but it looks like a song-filled first set with a ripping, jammy second set, including teases of Queen's Under Pressure during Down with Disease. Phish.net has 7 shows listed for Doolin's, the small bar in Vermont, all between February and late March of 1985. However, one show may not have actually taken place, as it has an identical set list to another show that is on record at the same venue. That is, of course, possible in Phish's earliest days, although Phish.net does have that first show grayed out. For the record, Phish has played in Austin 10 times as of the recording date, going back to 1990. This stat does not count shows in adjacent cities or towns that are in the greater Austin area. And finally, as of the date of this recording, Steven is correct. The band has not again played The Dogs directly until 46 days since July 28, 2015. And that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Steven Gripp for joining me today. Please check today's show notes for a link to his Phish Mapping Project. I'd like to thank Phish.net for their help with the fact check, the Mockingbird Foundation for everything they do, and Phish.in for the recording used in today's episode. If you enjoy Attendance Bias, please support the show. You could leave a rating and a review of it on your favorite podcast app. You could follow Attendance Bias on social media, and you can always go to www.buymeacoffee.com/attendance bias. Thank you so much again for listening, and I'll see you next time on Attendance Bias.